Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In some of the previous lessons, we were discussing about the crucial f7 square. We were discussing sacrifices on h7 and in attack in general. In this lesson, I'd like to draw your attention to another very typical type of sacrifice, and that is when your opponent moves up the h pawn just by one square, a black pawn to h6 or a white pawn to h3, and you have a bishop pointing right there and your queen behind your bishop, and your opponent has castled. There are many situations when it works very well to sacrifice your bishop for 2 pawns and a very serious attack. And I'd like to share with you some typical examples from real games. Let's see the first example. This game was played between the Estonian Grandmaster All versus Ivan Sokolov. And this position, it's White's turn, and as you can see the setup I mentioned, White has a queen on d2, a bishop on f4, and here are the important element in the black's position. Black has castle to the king's side and has the typical setup of pawns with the third pawn is being on h6, not on h7. What is also important is that the black knight is not on f6, but it's on e7. And because of White's e5 pawn, the black army is a little bit divided between the king's side and the queen's side. Black has kind of a difficulty in quickly shifting the pieces on the queen's side, the queen, the bishop, the knight, and the rook, in coming to the aid of the black king. Let's see how this works out in this actual game. White immediately sacrificed the bishop on h6. Of course, you may say black does not have to capture the bishop, which is definitely true. However, as I mentioned with similar sacrifices on h7, for example, in that case, White simply remains a pawn ahead while maintaining an attack. It may be that, objectively speaking, the game would have been dragged out longer. However, very often the opponent rather would capture the bishop and hope that the attack would fail, and then black would come out ahead, being a knight up. White simply recaptures with the queen on h6. If you're looking for an immediate threat, you will not find it, because White actually needs a couple more moves to bring aid to the queen's help. However, sadly for Black's pieces are unfortunately located and they are unable to really defend against the upcoming threat. And the upcoming threats there are a number of them. One of them is bringing the bishop to help the queen to come to h7. Another one is bringing the knight through f3 and g5 and then again queen h7. And as we shall see, in some cases, White may even be able to bring the rook and get it across the 4th rank. So Black has a lot of issues to deal with, and with all reality, they cannot successfully deal with all of them. For example, after knight g6, White would respond by playing knight f3, followed by knight g5. In the actual game, Black continued by playing rook to a5, trying to trade rooks, and with that, get to the e5 pawn, because at the moment, that's the rook that protects that pawn. But White doesn't need to waste time. White can follow immediately with bishop e4, threatening with an immediate checkmate. It's very important to remember that if now Black would play f5, White could do en passant and still renew the checkmate threat with queen h7, along with some new threats such as queen g7 checkmate or simply capturing the knight. But what happens if in this position after bishop e4 the black rook decides to run away and give some escape square for the black king on f8? Checking with the queen on h7 and then checking again on h8 would not be sufficient because the black knight would block just on time. However, after the black rook moves to a8, white now can force with a very typical method checkmate in 4 moves. And perhaps you remember it from one of our previous lessons. White is able to check, push the black king back to the corner, and now the bishop is ready to give a discovered check, and by his own choice, depending wherever the bishop wants to move, it's going to be a discovered check. And the right one is moving to g6. So when the king moves out, then comes queen h7, followed by checkmate with queen f7. Very nice. That's why after bishop e4, black tried knight g6 in the actual game. And now bishop took the knight, pawn took back, and queen took. White now is already having 3 pawns for the sacrificed piece. And now another forceful move by trading on c6. If now black would not capture the knight but the rook, then would come queen h6 check, followed by knight e7, winning the queen. Or, of course, also rook c4 looks quite tempting, with swinging the rook over to checkmate on h4. In the game, black took back with the pawn, in hoping that the black queen may come to the rescue on h7, but unfortunately for black it's a bit too slow because the rook comes immediately to c4, threatening checkmate. After queen h7 now, white could simply trade queens and then capture the black rook on a5. Black responded with queen d8 in hopes that if white now plays rook h4 check, then the queen would capture that rook and then capture the second rook as well on b5 and still be in the game. But instead, white can do much better. White can check with the queen first and then bring the rook to check on g4, and black resigned here because after king f7, white will checkmate in just a couple of moves. White can take the bishop right now on b7, or queen h5 is even more precise, followed by rook g7. A beautiful example on the bishop h6 sacrifice. Let's see another similar example on the same pattern. Here we go. This is a game played by Zelandinov against Ozvat in 1966, and the pattern is exactly the same. White sacrifices the bishop on h6 for 2 pawns and a serious attack. In this case, white's situation is even rosier because the bishop is already on c2, threatening with queen h7 checkmate on the next move. Again, if black moves his f-pawn to f5, white could do en passant, and of course the bishop on e6 would be hanging as well. Black here continued by playing bishop f5, closing up that diagonal of our bishop. And now white had to be very creative and aggressive. Trading the bishops would give black decent chances to survive the attack. However, white can play a beautiful move, namely rook e4, which is a sacrifice because the black bishop can now take the rook. If it wouldn't, the white rook could appear on h4. Black did take, and the white bishop took back, renewing that checkmate threat again on h7. If the black rook would move to e8, we reach the identical pattern as we saw in the previous example with the checkmate in 4 moves for white. Try to figure that out, and if you have difficulty with it, just go back to the previous position, and hopefully that will give you a sufficient hint. Black in the game had no other choice but to play f5, trying to interpose on that diagonal so the checkmate wouldn't happen. And now, as I mentioned, such situations en passant is the answer. Renewing the threat on h7, reopening the diagonal. And now black is in serious trouble. Black in the game took on f6, which of course white could simply just capture, leaving white with an extra pawn plus an attack. But white played differently. White gave bishop check on h7 rather. Now, if the king would move to h8, then white can force checkmate in 4 moves, namely by taking the rook and then checking with the knight and another check with the queen, and then finally the final check with the queen, checkmate on h7. The game, on the other hand, continued with black moving the king to f7. Now in this position, black is a rook ahead, but not for long, because white brings another piece to the attack, namely the knight, forcing the black king away from his rook. And now finally white can capture that rook. Black's position is very miserable because the black king will not find safety in this game. Black moved the queen out of the way to clear some escape for the black king, but white brings yet another piece to the attack. And after bishop d8, which defends the knight, a very important preventive move, preventing the escape of the black king, white just played bishop to f5, controlling that key potential escape square d7. So now the black king cannot escape there. On the other hand, black cannot really defend well against the checkmate threat with queen f7. Let's see another game that was played by 2 of the top grandmasters in the world. White was Gata Kamsky, who was actually a world champion candidate some years ago, and against one of the top French grandmasters at the time, Jean Lothier, and this game was played back in 1993. And again, looks like a rather symmetrical position with even material. White seems to be a tiny bit better developed, already his rook being on an open d-file, and more importantly, white is ready for the sacrifice. We are already familiar with on h6. So the game continued with bishop takes pawn. Again, if black does not capture the bishop, white is just a pawn ahead and maintaining still the threats such as queen g5 and so on. So the real question is what happens if black captures the bishop and white captures back. And in this position, black's best bet was to actually play queen b6. And when white would try to bring his rook to the attack, then black would have a cute sacrifice to at least fight back the attack, by sacrificing the queen and then giving a fork with the knight, capturing the queen even though white gets to capture the bishop. If you count material now, you'll realize that white is only one pawn ahead, which would still leave substantial work for white to actually win the game. Let's go back see what happened in the game after the sacrifice. Black didn't want to suffer in an endgame without a pawn, and rather tried to maintain the extra material, and played rook e8 with the idea to clear the f8 square for either the king or the bishop to kick the white queen back. If now white would play bishop to h7, black would capture that, and the game wouldn't be quite clear because now black would have a rook and two bishops, which in the numeric value would be 11 points, versus black's queen and two pawns, which is also 11 points. So in our reality, this would be an unclear position. Again, let's go back and see what happens after queen h6, rook e8. Kamsky played a better move, played the best move, as a matter of fact. Moved the bishop to c4, creating a discovery and attacking black's queen. Black will face two problems after this: whether he moves the queen or blocks the attack with the bishop, as black chose to play. Now, on one hand, white finally is able to bring the rook up on the d-file and then bring it over along the third or fourth rank to attack. And the second problem is that because of the white bishop now is on c4, white created a pin over black's f7 pawn, and white will have a queen g6 check when the right moment comes. Now, white continued with rook d4, a very powerful move, threatening to check with the queen on g6, followed by a rook checkmate on h4 if the king goes to the h-file. Black continued with bishop f8, attacking the white queen, and white, as planned, gave the check. Black blocks the check, and now white gets the third pawn. Typically, this automatically at least guarantees enough compensation or more when you have three pawns for the sacrificed bishop and still maintaining the attack. King moves to the corner and rook h4. But black was still defending, hanging on, and played knight h7. Now remember, this is not only a defensive move, but at the same time, black, in a sneaky way, created a discovery on the white rook. So white needs to push the issue, and in fact white has another nice combination to follow up the first one, namely to sacrifice the rook and then play queen h5, forcing black into the pin, then check with the bishop, and if now king g7, queen g6, or as in the game after king g8, white can simply capture the bishop. And now we can see that white has a bishop and three pawns for a rook, which is already more than a rook, while maintaining a deadly attack. The bishop is threatening to come back either to c4 or to h7, depending how black continues, and black's position is completely hopeless, and that's why black actually resigned in the game. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, the two sides have castled on opposite side of the board, and this has been a game between Diaz and Sierra Gonzalez. The difference here is that the white queen is not backing up the bishop after the sacrifice. However, here, white had a very elegant idea to follow up the sacrifice. White played bishop takes pawn, opening the G file, and now try to think for a moment or two and figure out the key move, how White can win the game. And that elegant move is playing rook d8. In fact, that move threatens with checkmate on the next move with knight captures pawn on f7. And if rook captures rook, then knight f7 checkmate anyway. The game continued with black playing knight g4. And now I bet there is more than one good way, but white continued with certainly one of them, knight f7. The knight cannot be captured because of the pin. King g7 and move the rook up to d4, attacking the black queen as well as knight, and black resigned. A very nice combination. And let's see one more example on this very theme. Here we go. Here again you can notice that the white queen is not directly backing the bishop after a sacrifice on h6. However, hopefully you'll notice a pattern that we saw a couple of positions ago, that the white bishop on b3 is pinning the black pawn on f7. And therefore, after bishop takes and pawn takes, white immediately can get his queen to h6, just as if the white queen would have been on the c1 h6 diagonal, as in some of the early positions we saw in this lesson. And then after king h8, here the queen is on h6. And now black blocked the check, and it seems not that clear how white can follow this attack up. After a natural bishop c2, which would threaten with checkmate with the queen, try to look for the black move, because it's also always very important to look out for not only your own good moves, but also of your opponent. Here the defense would be f5, and the attack would be pretty much over. Knight g5 at this moment wouldn't work either, because the black queen would simply capture it. So white needs to bring another piece to the help of the attack. And that move is knight e4. It's definitely a good move because it attacks the black bishop, while at the same time brought a backup for the g5 square. So now either of the white knights threaten to go there and to use the pin over the black knight. If now black would respond by playing f6, preventing either of the white knights from going to g5, then white's answer would be knight capturing the bishop and then bringing the bishop to help. The big difference now is that black is unable to play f5 because then the queen would be hanging. And after rook f7, which protects the knight, white can still play knight g5 using the pin on the f6 pawn, and now white has attacked the black rook as well as the pinned piece a third time, the knight on h7. Instead of playing f6, black in the game in this position responded with a different way, guarding that g5 square, bishop e7. And this is why it's so important to study chess tactics and strategy, to learn patterns that are quite difficult to recognize in a real game with limited time unless you've seen it before. Even if you've seen it before, it's not so simple to remember it, but you certainly would have a much better chance when your library of ideas is larger. And here is another pattern that is quite common in chess tactics. White plays knight f6, giving up the knight. because if the black bishop captures the knight now, then white gets to play bishop c2, and the whole point was that now the black bishop on f6 blocks the way of the pawn on f7. Because remember, in previous variations, always black's rescue was that when the bishop comes to c2, putting a second piece on that pinned knight on h7, then black would play f5. But now the bishop is in front of the pawn, and therefore black does not have that choice. Black, understanding the problem he faces, did not capture the knight, but brought his own other bishop to f5, protecting the knight on h7, and at the same time taking away the c2 square from the white bishop. White continued in a very energetic way by playing knight h5, threatening with immediate checkmate. If black would play rook g8, guarding against that, the plan was to respond with knight e5 with a checkmate threat of knight takes pawn on f7. Black's response was bishop to f6 rather. And now another beautiful move, bringing the knight to g5, threatening on one hand capturing the knight on h7 and then the bishop on f6, as well as the f7 pawn. Of course, the black bishop cannot capture the knight on g5 because that would release the defense of the g7 square. Black continued by playing bishop to d4, and white responded trading on h7 and with a quiet move, simply pinning the bishop. Black is in serious trouble now, threatening bishop c2 among other things. Black responded with f5, and white has the time. Don't forget, white has 2 pawns for the sacrificed piece, so it's not such a major material disadvantage. White brought a final piece to the attack, the rook f2 e1. Another threat is to capture the bishop on d4, followed by rook e7, against which black in all reality is helpless. After a few more moves, black resigned. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. This composition was made by Iskra in 1967. And the task is, how can white save the game? At first it looks rather hopeless because the black pawn on f2 is about to get promoted. As usual, I suggest you pause the recording and try to figure out the solution for yourself. When you come back, here is the solution. White plays f7, trying to promote his own pawn. Bishop captures, and now white plays knight f5. If the bishop captures the knight, then knight e3, and white catches the pawn. But what happens if the black pawn indeed promotes? Amazingly then, white can keep checking the black king, and the only way that black can escape the constant checks is by moving into a fork and giving up on his own queen. As you can see, if now the king goes elsewhere than what we saw already, for example to g4, knight e3, and the black queen will be lost and the game will be a draw. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, learned about ideas with sacrifices of a bishop on h6. Hopefully you can use them in your own games or avoid them on the other side of the board. And of course, I hope you enjoyed this Jewel of the Week. So long until next week.